Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my How to Make a Raven Egg walkthrough series, where I give a brief overview on some of the key components of the production process, looking into pre-production, production, and post-production, how they all link together, how they work together, the workflow, the pipeline process involved in creating a 2D image, coming up with a sketch, an illustration, concept art, a character sheet, and translating that idea from pre-production all the way now into production, where you translating some of those elements that you've composited together in a 2D form into a 3D space. We're talking lighting and shadows and form and placement, framing, composition, movement, some of those key areas that move across from part 1. Okay, so a big thing that we kind of touched on in part 1 is referencing, and referencing can mean referencing real world observation. It can mean doing research, conducting some form of research in collecting pictures, videos, just going out there and capturing some of this data yourself. In part 1 we completed this wonderful concept art of the raven egg. All right, I chose the raven egg because the raven egg plays a huge part. It's a key component of the Dog Days story, the world, the lore, and what unfolds, or how some of the perspectives that we see these ravens, they're responsible for it. All right, so they're not average crow or blackbird. These are really a different special breed. So much packed in this one image here, story wise, but I can't wait to dive into more of it. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. All right, so quick look back. We know that from the egg that we saw in the 2D concept art, I previewed the final animated footage on my IG. You could go check it out there, or just appreciate it here, but there's so much more on the IG to look at in terms of behind the scenes footage, more concept art, things that we're going to be doing in the future. It's going to show up there, so feel free to check it out. But this is essentially the shot. This is one of the actual shots that we're gonna try to clean up some more for Dog Days. And in the shot we have the egg that we created. Most of the top part of the actual shell are broken off or exposing whatever is going on the inside, which is just this kind of gelatinous embryotic sort of sac that's more or less keeping the raven inside. It's piercing its way through, and then we have some of this runny stuff coming down here. So all in all, we had an idea, we had a general direction, we know where the light was coming from, we had some sort of action happening in the scene, tell the story was happening. And what is that story? That something was being born, something was coming out of this raven egg, and that is essentially the mood and the tone that I was going for. So moving now into Blender, into a 3D space. All right, so I do all of my work inside of Blender. I think that any of the 3D work that you see is most likely going to be done or has been done inside of Blender, with maybe some post-processing, some touch-up work, or some additional effects might be done in After Effects. But those are the main two softwares that I use in creating a lot of these CG scenes, a lot of my CG shots. All right, so the 3D space now, this 3D egg, how we interpret that into the 3D space is that the egg is not identical to what we have out here. Okay, so the egg in this, you can see, is a lot more covered. You can see it's not as, I guess it doesn't have these scales, but it has like a rock, a cracked rock, a hardened, a molten lava, a dried molten lava sort of effect going on the outside. A lot of turbulent displacement, a lot of cracks. Okay, so it has a really nice organic look, while the concept has a more uniformed, very, almost like it's intentionally, all those scales were intentionally placed. And I suppose that, in reality they were, but in terms of if you're trying to go for adapting this information into a more realistic sense, where something gave birth to something that looks like this, and time and weather just chipped away at it, movement, maybe creatures attacked it, it has some story to it there, that something is going on And even when you look at the other eggs in the environment, you don't actually get to see many of them like this broken. So it means that something is special with this one because it's in camera. All right, and we could also see that on the ground we have little gelatinous blobs that look like it belong inside of the eggs, but we don't actually see where they came from, which means that those eggs might be goners and these are just the remnants, but they're alive. Something is moving. All right, you see that. All right, so we could see now that because of the design choices inside of Blender when we modeled it and put on the material, that even this having these chipped away parts be not as widespread as we saw in the concept, where more or less half of the egg is exposed, it creates a little more intrigue around it, while this provides a lot more visibility with the light hitting it, and we have some subsurface, some 2D, a 2D impression or interpretation of subsurface activity going on, piercing the substance that is housing the bird, and you're getting to see the nice pretty colors, the oranges, the yellows, the reds, the hints of the, that just the blend. But in the CG version, what I decided to do is I let the outside of the egg be very similar in terms of feel, as in tangibility. If you were to hold the egg, what you feel between your fingers, which is these ridges and whatnot, you get that kind of look here. But I let the inside of the egg, the red, drive the overall feel, to tone, the mood. This has a brighter, more optimistic, friendly, I suppose, in a way, a friendlier tone than this one. All right, this deeper red is just kind of, I don't know if you describe this as crimson, but this deeper red definitely gives off a different vibe. And we let transparency of this material, this glass material, more or less let the emission, the red emission on the inside, pierce through, giving that subsurface look, but definitely changing the overall tone, because we're working with a lot more red than yellows and oranges on this side. All right. In terms of the egg itself was fairly simple in how it was created. The first things first was that I simply created an icosphere. All right, and all I did to start was simply to scale this in. I'm gonna turn on the X-ray feature so I can grab the faces on the other side and change this to the selection box. And I think that looks pretty good so far. Yeah. So we have this very basic shape of the egg. Blender uses something called modifiers, and the modifiers are essentially Blender's built-in the tools that you can manipulate to change the nature or the shape, the form, just basically change the makeup of your mesh, your model. And the mesh in your model would be this egg that we're seeing here. Once you get a hang of what these different modifiers do, it gets fun to use. It gets really nice to play with the different tools, but it allows you to get a lot more creative. So we're just going to select the subdivision surface, which is going to add a lot more faces to the geometry, bringing it closer to what could be considered a smooth shell shape, an egg shape. All right, and what we're going to do is increase the subdivisions. All right, crank that up to 4. All right, so we can see now, once I hit shade smooth, this looks pretty good. A little lumpy, but we could just spend some more time with it and bring this to a more refined finish product. All right, that looks pretty good in my opinion. So that was more or less it. That was the full extent of how I accomplished that shape, the shape of these eggs over here, and I just more or less copied the shape and placed it where I needed it. So in the scene, we knew that we could see that I set the lights up All right, we have these gelatinous blobs with lights inside of them, the emitters, and then we have, of course, these lights in the scene giving the source of. The idea was to have the light that we saw here. All right, basically, if the image were flipped, the light is now coming on from the right side, because then the image is coming from the top left, it's now coming from the top right. And with that directional light coming down on the egg, it's supposed to provide some intense lighting on the edge of the egg, as you would have seen in the concept art. Alright, so it's not going to be as harsh just yet, but that's where in post-production we would have increased some of the values. I like to play with the actual color correction posts, but there are some artists that prefer to do it inside of the software, and it is accessible inside of Blender. Once you go all the way down to color management and to use the curves, you have the option to adjust exposure and the gamma levels and the curves, you know, similarly to what you might find in any of your post production software, any editing software. All right, so but what I like to do, what I prefer to do, is do it inside of After Effects or Premiere as needed, depending on where I am in the stage of editing, and we're gonna go with that. So in the concept art, we had that rim light action going on there, we had the scales collecting some light, and we have our own version of that here. Okay, so now that we've accomplished that, we have our light set up. The light is also not pure white. Both of these lights, if you look at the color of the lights here, it has this sort of peach overtone or undertone. So it's that nice blend that allows the red to shine through. Some light, the opportunity to pass through these gelatinous blobs that we see. And that is essentially how the color and the lighting was set up. The idea behind the material, however, is that thanks to Blender Kit's built-in library, we can search for certain materials that we might need. So in this case, I would have said something like rock if I wanted to give the egg a sort of dragon scale finish, but may not want to use dragon scales. I would simply select my egg, go to the faces, select all. We want to unwrap the mesh. We want to make sure that the UVs are unwrapped so that when we apply the materials, the shaders, that they would apply to the model correctly. Alright, and there, boom, it's unwrapped. Now that that's unwrapped, we can go to the library and just drag on a material that we like. Our egg has this kind of rock texture. Now, yeah, this looks pretty good in the lighting setup, don't you think? So let's compare it next to our previous model. So we've seen now that I've applied the material and whatnot. What I did next was create a duplicate of this object. I took the egg and I removed this material and I added a new material, and I simply added a glass material. All right. The frosted glass material, I simply just changed the color, which naturally was white, and I changed it to red. Once I created this particular inner part of the egg, all it simply left for me to do was to copy the shell and more or less just make sure that it fits. So that's good, and we'll scale them up. Right, now that he's scaled up, and what I'm going to do now is select a couple of these faces. Or what we'll do next is these little blobs. They're essentially an icosphere that had a subdivision surface modifier applied to it. So it's essentially the same shape egg, that oval shape that we have going on there. Alright, it's egg shape, and we applied a subdivision surface, and now that that's been applied inside of this, in this we have an emission shader that is applied to it. And what this does is that if you were to crank this up, it acts as the glow or light that's going on inside of the egg. So what we did is took this, placed it in the egg. Alright, nice. So now that it's in the egg, we can see now that the egg already begins to have some character to it, right? The light is hitting it nicely, and if I wanted a couple more of eggs galore. Alright, so we see now how the egg was created by using that icosphere, applying subdivision surface modifier, adding a material, but prior to that we unwrapped the mesh, we added a material to the mesh, and then we deleted some of the faces to create the sort of chipped away, broken away outer shell look. Alright, there's wear and tear. And then the last couple parts, the last couple steps to this process inside of Blender would be setting up the camera, which I already have set up here. I already set up my resolution working with 2538 by 1080, but the standard resolution that most persons might want to export in would be 1920 by 1080. If you want to get a little fancier and you want a higher resolution, you might want to go 4K, but ultimately, as long as your samples are good, that your bit depth is at 16-bit, and you're using maybe if you're using your render passes to get more control, you're gonna have a really nice time. So once your camera is set up, your render settings is set up, and you hit render, what happens next is that this entire sequence, this very slow camera animation that you see here, all of the elements that you see, the lights, the materials, the actual egg, the ground, all of the cracks that you see, all of these things are going to be output into a sequence of images called a PNG sequence. Now I choose that format because I like the fact that it gives me a little more control in the post-production process, especially when I want to output really quick scenes. So typically in larger productions, they may want to render out the various elements in passes, so foreground, midground, background, and then you might have your eggs in your foreground and the floor in the foreground and your mist and your fog, and you render out all of these different things until you export all of the different slices in your scene, and then recomposite all of that in the post-production end of things by recompiling all of those images and having it play as one sequence, giving you a little more control in terms of how you can edit the properties of each component. Alright, so but in part 3, what we are definitely going to cover is the exporting process out of Blender, what to do with the files once we get into our post-processing software, our post-production software, whether that be After Effects. We're most likely going to jump into After Effects to do the compositing of the effects, the overlays, and then we are going to render everything out, make sure that we have our color correction, our color grading done, add some sound, and then get ready to post the content. So please join me in part 3 as I walk through the final act, the final part to the process, and I hope that the first 2 phases have been a blast. I know it has been for me. I enjoy sharing this kind of information. I enjoy creating this kind of stuff, and Dog Days has been a very a project that's been close to my heart for a very long time, and working on any of these small scenes, any chance I get to work on it and share it with you, I'll definitely do so. And that's what we're going to be doing going forward. So stick around for part 3. Keep your eyes peeled, keep a lookout, keep your ear to the ground. Just remember to stay focused, stay consistent, and remember to follow the compass. Thanks for all of the support. I hope it was worth the watch, and I look forward to talking with you in the last part. Catch you then, stay safe, and thanks guys. Bye.